The red rocks of Utah Territory stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, their ancient faces bearing witness to countless stories of survival and sacrifice. In the shadow of these towering monuments, the small Apache settlement of Whispering Canyon had learned to make do with very little. Ayanna Crowfeather sat outside her grandmother's wickiup, grinding corn with stones worn smooth by generations of women before her. At 22, she possessed the classic beauty of her people: high cheekbones, obsidian eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the desert, and long black hair that caught the morning light like captured starfire. But beauty was a luxury her people could no longer afford. The corn she ground was the last they had. The government rations promised by treaty had been delayed again, and the hunting had been poor for 3 moons running. Children cried from hunger, and the elders spoke in worried whispers about the coming winter. "Ayanna," called her grandmother, Sunflower Woman, from within the dwelling. "Come." Inside the dim wickiup, the old woman sat wrapped in a faded blanket, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Despite her 80 years, her eyes remained sharp as obsidian blades. "Grandmother, you should rest," Ayanna said, kneeling beside her. "There is no rest for the worried," Sunflower Woman replied. "Tell me what you see when you look at our people." Ayanna glanced toward the entrance, where she could see the small settlement. Children played listlessly in the dust, their ribs showing beneath their skin. Women worked with the mechanical movements of the defeated, while men sat in councils that solved nothing because there was nothing to solve. They simply had no food, no money, no hope. "I see suffering," Ayanna whispered, "and what would you do to end it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ayanna had been wrestling with this very thought for weeks, ever since she'd overheard the conversation between 2 men at the trading post in Moab. One had been Jacob "Blackjack" Morrison, a gunslinger whose reputation stretched from Texas to California. A man who collected people like other men collected horses, useful for a while, then discarded when they outlived their purpose. He was wealthy, powerful, and completely without conscience. The other had been his associate, speaking of Morrison's tastes, his preference for exotic companions, his willingness to pay handsomely for what he wanted. "I would do anything," Ayanna said finally, her voice barely audible. Sunflower Woman reached out and touched her granddaughter's face with trembling fingers. "That is what I was afraid you would say." That evening, as the desert cooled and painted itself in shades of purple and gold, Ayanna made her decision. She put on her finest dress, a doe-skin garment decorated with intricate beadwork that her mother had made before the fever took her. She braided her hair with silver ornaments that had been in her family for generations. She was preparing to sacrifice herself, and she would do it with dignity. The ride to Moab took 2 hours on her spotted pony. The town was a rough collection of wooden buildings, saloons, and gambling houses that served the miners, ranchers, and drifters who made Utah Territory their temporary home. Oil lamps flickered in windows like malevolent eyes, and the sound of rough laughter and clinking glasses spilled from the establishments into the dusty street. Morrison was exactly where she'd expected to find him, in the Red Rock Saloon, holding court at a private table in the back. He was a tall man, with steel-grey hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to assess everything in terms of monetary value. His clothes were expensive but practical: black coat, silver-buttoned vest, and a gun belt that had seen plenty of use. When he saw her approach, a slow smile spread across his face like oil on water. "Well, well," he said, not bothering to stand. "What have we here?" Ayanna forced herself to meet his gaze directly. She had practiced this moment, rehearsed the words, steeled herself for his reaction. "I am Ayanna Crowfeather," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I come to make a proposition." Morrison's smile widened. He gestured to an empty chair across from him. "I'm listening." She sat carefully, maintaining her composure even as she felt the stares of other patrons burning into her back. "My people are starving. We need money for food, supplies, medicine. I know you are, a collector of fine things, and you're offering yourself as the latest addition to my collection. His voice held amusement and something darker. "For 6 months," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "In exchange for $500 in gold, delivered to my grandmother in Whispering Canyon." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her like a man considering the purchase of livestock. "You're even more beautiful up close," he said. "But beauty fades, my dear. What else do you offer?" Ayana's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "Loyalty, discretion, companionship without complaint or resistance." "Ah," Morrison nodded appreciatively. "You understand the terms of our arrangement." "I like that in a business partner." He reached into his vest and withdrew a leather pouch heavy with gold coins, setting it on the table between them. $500, he said. "But I want a full year, not 6 months. Non-negotiable." Ayana stared at the pouch. It represented salvation for her people, but damnation for herself. A year of her life, her dignity, her soul. "Deal," she whispered. Morrison's hand shot out and grasped her wrist, not violently, but with unmistakable possession. "Excellent. You belong to me now, Ayana Crowfeather, and I take very good care of my possessions." As he led her from the saloon, neither of them noticed the lone cowboy sitting in the far corner, his weathered hat pulled low over his eyes. Tom Mackenzie had been nursing the same whiskey for 2 hours, trying to work up the courage to approach the telegraph office to send word about his brother's death. But now, watching the proud Apache woman walk away with Morrison, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in months: righteous anger. He knew Morrison's reputation. He knew what fate awaited this brave woman who had sacrificed herself for her people. And for the first time since his brother's funeral, Tom Mackenzie had a purpose beyond mere survival. He was going to save her. The question was, how? 3 weeks had passed since Tom Mackenzie witnessed Ayana's deal with the devil, and the image haunted him like a persistent ghost. Every morning, when he woke in his small cabin outside Moab, every night when he tried to sleep, he saw her face, the mixture of pride and resignation as she accepted Morrison's terms. Tom was a man of 34 years who had learned that life rarely offered second chances at heroism. He'd been born in Missouri to a farming family, but the call of the West had pulled him and his younger brother David to Utah Territory 5 years ago. They'd planned to start a cattle ranch, maybe find wives, build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful land. But David had been killed 2 months ago in a mining accident, crushed when a poorly supported tunnel collapsed. Tom had been left alone with their small herd of cattle, a modest cabin, and a grief that seemed to grow heavier each day. He was not a wealthy man. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots worn but serviceable. He owned 2 horses, a reliable brown gelding named Buck and David's spirited black mare Shadow, which he hadn't had the heart to sell. His most valuable possessions were his Colt .45 and a small savings of $200 hidden beneath a loose floorboard. But more than anything, Tom Mackenzie was a man who understood right from wrong with the clarity that comes from having lived through both. On this particular morning, he was in Moab's general store buying supplies when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "Morrison's got himself a real prize this time," one man was saying to another near the pickle barrel. "That Indian girl he's been keeping. Pretty as a picture, but I heard tell she's getting a bit spirited." "How so?" asked his companion. "Word is she tried to escape twice. Morrison had to teach her some lessons about obedience." "If you know what I mean." Tom's hands tightened on the bag of flour he was holding. The store clerk, old Pete Williamson, noticed his expression. "You all right there, Tom? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tom forced himself to relax his grip. "Just thinking about something I need to take care of, Pete." But as he completed his purchases, Tom's mind was racing. He'd been watching Morrison's compound for weeks, trying to figure out how to approach the situation. Morrison lived in a fortified ranch house 5 miles outside town, surrounded by high walls and armed guards. He employed 6 men, not just ranch hands, but professional gunmen who owed their loyalty to Morrison's gold rather than any sense of honor. The smart thing would be to mind his own business. Tom knew he was outgunned, outmanned, and outmatched. Morrison was faster with a pistol, richer and more ruthless than Tom could ever hope to be. Any direct confrontation would likely end with Tom dead and Ayanna still trapped. But intelligence and moral courage often pointed in different directions. That afternoon, Tom rode out to the ridge overlooking Morrison's compound. Through his father's old spyglass, he could see the layout clearly. The main house, bunkhouse for the hired guns, stables, and a high wooden fence that surrounded the entire property. As he watched, he saw her. Ayanna was hanging laundry on a line behind the house, her movements mechanical and lifeless. Gone was the proud bearing he remembered from the saloon. Her shoulders were hunched, her head down. Even from this distance, Tom could see that something fundamental had been broken in her. What would David do? Tom asked himself aloud, a habit he'd developed since his brother's death. The answer came immediately. David would have ridden down there the first day and gotten himself killed trying to be a hero. David had always been the brave one, the impulsive one, the brother who acted first and considered consequences later. But David was dead, and Tom had learned that martyrdom helped no one. As he watched, one of Morrison's men, a lean, cruel-faced individual named Garrett, approached Ayanna. Even from a distance, Tom could see the threatening posture, the way Ayanna flinched and stepped back. Tom's jaw tightened. Planning was one thing, but seeing her mistreated was another entirely. That evening, Tom rode into town and made his way to the Prospector's Den, a smaller, quieter saloon than the Red Rock where Morrison held court. He nursed a beer and listened, learning what he could about Morrison's routines and habits. Morrison's planning a big poker game next Friday, he overheard from a conversation between two local merchants. Invited some high rollers from Salt Lake City. Word is, there'll be serious money on that table. Tom filed that information away. A poker game meant Morrison would be distracted, focused on impressing his guests. It might provide the opportunity Tom was looking for, but he needed help. And there was only one person in Moab he trusted enough to confide in. Father Miguel Santos was the Catholic priest who served the small Mexican community on the outskirts of town. He was a man of 60 with kind eyes and steady hands, who had seen enough of frontier life to understand that sometimes good men had to make difficult choices. Tom found him in the small chapel, preparing for evening prayers. "Father," Tom said, removing his hat, "I need guidance." Father Miguel looked up from his prayer book and studied Tom's face in the candlelight. "You have the look of a man wrestling with his conscience. My son, sit. Tell me what troubles you." Tom sat in the front pew and, in halting words, told the priest about Ayanna, Morrison, and his growing conviction that he had to act. When he finished, Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment. "This woman," the priest finally said, "she means something to you?" Tom considered the question honestly. "I don't know her, Father. I spoke to her exactly once, months ago at the trading post. She was buying medicine for her grandmother, but she didn't deserve what's happened to her." "Nobody does," Father Miguel nodded slowly. "And you believe it's your responsibility to save her?" "I believe it's my responsibility to try." The priest studied Tom's face in the flickering candlelight. "You know this Morrison will kill you if he can, probably, and you're willing to die for a stranger." Tom was quiet for a moment, thinking of his brother, of all the things he'd failed to do, all the chances he'd missed to be better than he was. "David always said, I thought too much and acted too little," he said finally. "Maybe it's time to prove him wrong." Father Miguel reached over and placed a weathered hand on Tom's shoulder. "Then may God grant you wisdom along with your courage, my son. You'll need both." As Tom left the chapel, he felt something he hadn't experienced since David's death: purpose. It might be a purpose that got him killed, but it was better than the empty existence he'd been living. He had 6 days to figure out how to save Ayanna Crowfeather. Time to get to work. Ayanna stood at the window of Morrison's opulent bedroom, staring out at the Utah landscape she'd once called home. The view was beautiful, Red cliffs catching the morning sun, endless sky stretching toward eternity, but it might as well have been a painting for all the freedom it represented. 3 months. She'd survived 3 months of Jacob Morrison's ownership, and each day had chipped away another piece of her soul. He wasn't physically violent in the way she'd feared. Morrison was too sophisticated for crude brutality. Instead, he wielded control through humiliation, isolation, and the constant reminder that her people's survival depended on her compliance. "Admiring the scenery, my dear?" Morrison's voice came from behind her, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. Ayanna didn't turn around. She learned that showing him her face only encouraged his need to see her react to his presence. "I was thinking about the weather," she said carefully. "It looks like it might rain." He moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. "Rain would be good for the ranches. Though I suppose it matters little to you now. You're a town woman after all." The casual cruelty of the comment wasn't lost on her. Morrison took pleasure in reminding her that she'd been severed from her people, her land, her identity. In his mind, she was now simply another of his possessions, like the imported furniture or the thoroughbred horses. "I need to go to the market today," she said. "We're low on supplies." Morrison considered this. He allowed her supervised trips to town once a week, partly to maintain the illusion that she was there willingly, partly because he enjoyed the way other men looked at her, knowing she belonged to him. "Very well. Garrett will accompany you as usual." Ayanna suppressed a shudder. Garrett was Morrison's lieutenant, a thin man with dead eyes who seemed to take particular pleasure in making her uncomfortable. But the weekly trip to town was her only respite from the suffocating atmosphere of the compound. So she endured his company. An hour later, she was walking through Moab's main street, with Garrett trailing behind her like a faithful dog. The townspeople gave them a wide berth. Everyone knew who she was and who owned her. Some looked at her with pity, others with disgust, but none with recognition of her humanity. It was at the general store that she saw him again. Tom Mackenzie stood near the front counter, examining a new bridle. He was dressed in clean but worn clothing, his hat pushed back to reveal sandy brown hair and grey eyes that held a depth of character she remembered from their brief meeting months ago. Their eyes met across the store, and she saw something in his gaze that she hadn't encountered in months: respect. Not pity, not disgust, not the calculating appraisal of men who saw her as Morrison's exotic pet. Just quiet, steady respect for her as a person. Tom touched the brim of his hat in a subtle acknowledgement, and she felt her heart flutter for the first time in months. "Hurry up," Garrett said from behind her, his voice harsh with impatience. "Morrison don't like you socializing." The spell was broken. Ayanna completed her purchases quickly and followed Garrett back to the compound, but Tom's eyes stayed with her. That evening, as she prepared Morrison's dinner, her hands shook slightly as she worked. She told herself it was nothing, just a moment of human connection in an ocean of isolation. But some part of her that she'd thought Morrison had killed began to stir with something that might have been hope. Meanwhile, Tom was putting his plan into motion. He'd spent the past 6 days studying Morrison's routines with the patience of a hunter. He knew when the guards changed shifts, when Morrison took his evening walks, when Garrett made his rounds. Most importantly, he'd confirmed that Friday's poker game would draw Morrison and most of his men into the main house, leaving the compound less heavily guarded than usual. But Tom wasn't planning a direct assault. He was planning something far more dangerous. He was going to walk up to the front door and ask for... Father Miguel had tried to dissuade him from this. "Approach, you cannot simply reason with a man like Morrison," the priest had warned. "He understands only power and money." "Then I'll have to find a way to speak his language," Tom had replied. The plan was simple in its audacity. Tom would arrive during the poker game, when Morrison would be surrounded by wealthy men whose respect he craved. Tom would challenge Morrison publicly, not to a gunfight, but to a test of character. He would offer to buy Ayana's freedom, putting Morrison in a position where refusing would make him look weak in front of his guests. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot Tom could think of that didn't involve storming a fortified compound single-handed. On Friday evening, Tom bathed, shaved, and put on his best clothes, a black suit that had belonged to his father, polished boots, and a clean white shirt. He strapped on his gun belt and checked his Colt one last time. He wasn't planning to use it, but in Morrison's world, an unarmed man was a joke. The ride to Morrison's compound took 20 minutes. As he approached the gate, Tom could hear the sounds of the poker game drifting from the main house. Laughter, clinking glasses, the shuffle of cards. Oil lamps blazed in every window, making the place look almost festive. The guard at the gate was a young man Tom didn't recognize. Probably hired for the evening. "State your business," the guard said. Rifle held casually but ready. "Tom Mackenzie to see Mr. Morrison," Tom replied, his voice steady. "I have a business proposition that can't wait." The guard looked uncertain. "He's in the middle of a game. Big money players from Salt Lake. Tell him it's about his Apache woman. He'll want to hear what I have to say." After a moment's hesitation, the guard sent another man to the house. 5 minutes later, Garrett emerged, his hand resting on his gun. "Morrison says you can come in," Garrett said. "But keep your hands where I can see them." Tom dismounted and walked toward the house, his heart pounding, but his expression calm. Through the windows, he could see the poker table. 5 men in expensive suits, Morrison at the head, and Ayana standing silently in the corner like a piece of decorative sculpture. This was it. The moment that would determine whether he saved her or got them both killed. Tom Mackenzie straightened his shoulders and walked through Jacob Morrison's door. The poker room fell silent as Tom Mackenzie entered, his boots echoing on the polished wood floor. The air was thick with cigar smoke, and the tension that comes when strangers interrupt expensive games. 5 men sat around an ornate table laden with cash, chips, and crystal glasses, but Tom's attention was immediately drawn to the corner where Ayana stood. She wore a green silk dress that Morrison had obviously chosen for her, beautiful but confining, like everything else in her life. Her face was carefully composed, but Tom caught the flicker of surprise and something else, hope, that passed through her eyes when she saw him. Morrison leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing at his lips. He was clearly enjoying the dramatic interruption. "Gentlemen," Morrison said to his guests, "allow me to introduce Tom Mackenzie, local cattle rancher and apparently man of mystery." "Tom, you've interrupted a rather substantial pot. I trust your business is urgent." The other players, men from Salt Lake City with soft hands and expensive watches, looked at Tom with mild curiosity. To them, he was probably just another cowboy with a grievance. Tom removed his hat and stood straight, meeting Morrison's gaze directly. "It is urgent. Mr. Morrison, I've come to make you an offer." "How intriguing." Morrison gestured toward an empty chair. "Please sit. Share your proposition with all of us." Tom remained standing. "I've come to buy the lady's freedom." The silence that followed was profound. One of the Salt Lake men cleared his throat uncomfortably, while another took a careful sip of his whiskey. Morrison's smile widened. "Buy her freedom? My dear Tom, I'm afraid you're laboring under a misapprehension. Miss Crow Feather isn't a slave. She's here voluntarily under the terms of a legitimate business arrangement." "Call it what you want," Tom said steadily. "I'm offering to pay off her contract." "Name your price." Morrison chuckled and glanced at his guests. "You see, gentlemen, this is the frontier spirit we hear so much about. Noble cowboys rescuing distressed damsels." He turned back to Tom. "But I'm curious, Mr. Mackenzie, what's your interest in my companion?" Tom had prepared for this question. "I believe every person should have the right to choose their own path. She made her choice under duress to help her people. I'm offering her a different choice." "How romantic," Morrison said dryly. "And what exactly are you offering? Surely you realize that Ayana's services are quite valuable?" The insult hung in the air like smoke. Tom felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. I have $200 in gold, a small cattle herd worth about 300 more, and a homestead with 40 acres. Everything I own, I'll sign over to you in exchange for her freedom." One of the Salt Lake men leaned forward with interest. "That's a generous offer for a stranger." "Mr. Mackenzie," before Tom could respond, Morrison laughed. A cold sound that contained no humor. $500 for a year-long contract that's already 3 months old? I'm afraid that doesn't even cover my initial investment, let alone the appreciation in value that's occurred since then. Tom's hands clenched into fists, but he forced them to relax. "Then what would you consider fair?" Morrison pretended to consider the question, clearly enjoying himself. "Well, let's see. The original contract was for $500 over 12 months. But Ayanna has proven quite entertaining. I'd say her current market value is closer to $1,000. It was an impossible sum, more money than Tom could raise in 5 years. Morrison knew it, and he was savoring Tom's helplessness. "However," Morrison continued, "I'm a sporting man. Perhaps we could arrange a different sort of wager." Tom's instincts screamed danger, but he had no choice but to listen. "What kind of wager?" Morrison stood and walked to a gun cabinet in the corner, withdrawing an ornate dueling pistol. "You want to play the hero, Mr. Mackenzie? Then let's give these gentlemen a real show. A contest of skill and nerve, a duel." One of the Salt Lake men asked, suddenly more interested. "Not a duel, precisely," Morrison said, examining the pistol. "More of a test. You see, gentlemen, there's an old frontier tradition called courage shooting. 2 men take turns firing at increasingly dangerous targets, until one loses his nerve or his accuracy." Tom had heard of such contests, usually conducted by drunk cowboys trying to impress saloon girls. They typically ended with someone getting maimed or killed. "What are you proposing?" Tom asked. Morrison's smile was predatory. "We start simple, targets at 50 yards. Each round, we move the targets closer and make the shots more difficult. First man to miss or refuse a shot loses, and if I win. If you win, Ayanna goes free." "If I win," Morrison glanced at the Apache woman who had gone pale but remained silent. "If I win, you leave and never return, and Ayanna's contract gets extended to 2 years. The terms were impossible. Morrison was known to be one of the finest shots in the territory, while Tom was merely competent with a gun. But looking at Ayanna's face, seeing the mixture of fear and desperate hope, Tom knew he had no choice. "I accept," he said. Morrison clapped his hands together delightedly. "Excellent. Gentlemen, shall we adjourn to the courtyard? This should be quite entertaining." As the group moved outside, Ayanna found herself walking beside Tom for a moment. "You don't have to do this," she whispered urgently. "He'll kill you." Tom looked at her, seeing not Morrison's possession, but the proud Apache woman who had sacrificed herself for her people. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But if I don't try, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror again." In the torchlit courtyard, Morrison's men set up targets while the Salt Lake City gamblers placed side bets. Morrison stripped off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, clearly in his element. Tom checked his Colt one final time, saying a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening. He was about to gamble his life on his ability to outshoot one of the deadliest men in Utah territory. But some things were worth the risk. Some people were worth dying for. The courtyard of Morrison's compound blazed with torchlight as the 2 men prepared for their contest. The Salt Lake City gamblers had eagerly accepted Morrison's invitation to witness what they assumed would be a one-sided demonstration of frontier marksmanship. They stood in a semicircle behind a safe line, drinks in hand, treating the event like an entertaining diversion from their poker game. Ayanna stood apart from the others, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She understood what Tom Mackenzie was risking for her, not just his life, but his dignity, his future, everything he'd worked to build in this harsh territory. The weight of his sacrifice pressed against her chest like a physical thing. Morrison's men had set up the first targets, empty whiskey bottles balanced on fence posts 50 yards away. Standard shooting gallery fare, the kind of targets both men could hit with their eyes closed. "Gentlemen," Morrison announced to his audience, "we'll begin with these simple targets. The contestant who misses first loses the round. Each successive round will present a greater challenge." He gestured toward Tom with mock courtesy. "Mr. Mackenzie, as my guest, you may shoot first." Tom drew his Colt, the familiar weight of the weapon steady in his hand. He'd owned this gun for 8 years, had practiced with it countless hours, but never with stakes like these. He raised the pistol, sighted carefully, and squeezed the trigger. The bottle exploded in a shower of glass. "Excellent," Morrison called out, then drew his own weapon, a pearl-handled Colt .45 that gleamed in the torchlight. He fired without seeming to aim, and his bottle disintegrated as completely as Tom's had. The Salt Lake men murmured appreciatively. This was going to be a real contest after all. For the next 3 rounds, both men hit their targets perfectly. Bottles, tin cans, playing cards pinned to posts, everything shattered under their accurate fire. Morrison seemed relaxed, almost bored, while Tom remained focused, but increasingly tense. "Time to make things interesting," Morrison announced after they'd each hit 6 consecutive targets. He signaled to Garrett, who brought out a wooden board with an apple balanced on top. 50 yards is rather generous. Shall we try 30? At 30 yards, the apple was a small target that required real precision. Tom steadied himself, controlled his breathing, and fired. The apple exploded in a spray of juice and pulp. Morrison's shot was equally accurate, the apple disappearing as if it had never existed. 20 yards, Morrison called out, and Tom felt his first real flutter of concern. At 20 yards, even a slight tremor in the hand could mean a miss. Both men hit their targets, but Tom noticed that his apple hadn't been destroyed as completely as Morrison's. The gunslinger's shot had been perfectly centered. While Tom's had caught the edge, Morrison noticed too. His smile grew wider. "You're quite good, Mr. Mackenzie, better than I expected. But let's see how you handle real pressure." For the next target, Morrison had his men set up something that made Tom's blood run cold. A silver dollar balanced on the edge of a fence post at 15 yards. Missing the coin would mean hitting the wooden post, a shot that could ricochet unpredictably toward the spectators. "This is madness," one of the Salt Lake men muttered, but none of them moved away. The gambling fever had taken hold, and they wanted to see how the contest would end. Tom studied the target, calculating angles and considering the risk. At 15 yards, with torchlight creating dancing shadows, hitting a silver dollar required not just skill, but luck. He raised his pistol, held his breath and fired. The coin spun away into the darkness with a clear ringing sound. He'd hit it dead center. Morrison's shot was equally perfect, the dollar disappearing with a metallic ping. "Impressive," Morrison said, reloading his weapon. "But I think it's time we raised the stakes considerably." What he ordered next made even his own men exchange nervous glances. Garrett brought out a wooden stick about the size of a pencil and planted it upright in a small mound of dirt. The target was barely visible in the torchlight, a thin line against the darkness. 10 yards, Morrison announced. Hit the stick without touching the dirt. It was nearly impossible. At 10 yards, in flickering light, hitting something so thin required the kind of precision that separated legendary shooters from merely skilled ones. Tom stepped up to the firing line, his mouth dry as desert sand. This was beyond skill, this was pure chance, and they both knew it. He raised his gun, tried to sight on the nearly invisible target, and pulled the trigger. The stick remained standing. A murmur went through the crowd. Tom had missed his first shot. Morrison stepped forward confidently, aimed and fired. The stick snapped in half and toppled over. "It appears we have a winner," Morrison said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Mr. Mackenzie, you've provided excellent entertainment, but I'm afraid our business is concluded. Ayana's contract has been extended to 2 years, as agreed." Tom stood frozen, staring at the fallen stick. He'd failed. After all his planning, all his courage, he'd failed when it mattered most. Ayanna would remain Morrison's prisoner, and there was nothing he could do about it. But then Ayanna herself stepped forward. "Wait," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The contest isn't over." Morrison turned to her with surprise and annoyance. "My dear, the terms were quite clear. First man to miss loses. But you both missed," Ayanna said calmly. "I beg your pardon." She walked to the target area and picked up something from the dirt near the broken stick. When she returned, she held out her hand to show a small piece of wood. "Mr. Mackenzie's bullet hit the stick," she said. "It just didn't break it completely. Look at the mark. Indeed, there was a clear groove in the wood where Tom's bullet had grazed it." Morrison's face darkened. "That's not a hit, it's a near miss." "The terms were to hit the stick," Ayanna said firmly. "You didn't specify that it had to break." Mr. Mackenzie hit his target. The Salt Lake men began murmuring among themselves, clearly intrigued by this development. Morrison looked around at their faces and realized that his reputation for fairness was being questioned by men whose respect he valued. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "One more round. But this time we end it definitively." What he set up next was terrifying in its simplicity. A single match, unlit, stuck vertically in the ground at 8 yards. The target was so small it was barely visible, even with the torches. "Light the match without breaking it," Morrison said, his voice cold with fury. The friction from a perfectly placed bullet should ignite the sulfur tip. It was an impossible shot. Tom had heard stories of legendary gunmen performing such feats, but he'd always assumed they were tall tales told in saloons. No one could be that accurate, that lucky. But as he looked at Ayanna's face, seeing not just hope but absolute faith in him, Tom felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't about marksmanship anymore. This was about standing up when it mattered, about proving that some things were worth any risk. "I'll go first," Tom said quietly. He walked to the firing line, his Colt feeling heavier than it ever had before. 8 yards away, the match stood like a tiny sentinel in the dirt, barely visible in the dancing torchlight. Tom closed his eyes for a moment, remembering every shooting lesson his father had given him, every hour of practice he'd put in over the years. Then he opened them, raised his pistol, and found that everything around him had gone quiet. The murmuring crowd, the crackling torches, even his own heartbeat. There was only the gun in his hand, the impossible target, and the woman whose freedom depended on the next few seconds. Tom Mackenzie pulled the trigger. The match flared to life. For a moment, no one moved. The tiny flame flickered bravely in the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the faces of the stunned spectators. Tom himself stared in amazement. He'd actually done it. The Salt Lake men burst into applause, whooping and shouting like they'd just witnessed a miracle. Even Morrison's own men looked impressed despite themselves. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Lucky shot," he said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Let's see if I can match it." He stepped up to the firing line, his face grim with concentration. The pearl handle of his gun gleamed as he raised it. Sighting carefully on the still-burning match, Morrison fired. The match exploded in a shower of sparks and splinters. "Too much force," one of the Salt Lake men observed. "Destroyed the target instead of lighting it." Morrison's jaw tightened. "The match was lit when I fired." "That should count." "But it was already lit by Mr. Mackenzie's shot," another gambler pointed out. "Your task was to light an unlit match." The crowd murmured agreement. Morrison looked around at their faces and saw something he wasn't accustomed to: judgment. These were wealthy, influential men whose opinions mattered in Salt Lake City society. Their disapproval could damage his reputation far beyond Utah territory. "Well," said the eldest of the Salt Lake men, a silver-haired gentleman who wore his authority like a fine coat, "it seems clear to me that Mr. Mackenzie has won your contest, Morrison. The terms should be honored." Morrison stood silent for a long moment, his hand still holding the smoking pistol. Tom could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing his reputation against his pride, his future business prospects against his desire for revenge. Finally, Morrison holstered his weapon. "Indeed," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "A deal is a deal, gentlemen. Miss Crowfeather, it appears your contract has been terminated." Ayana stepped forward, hardly daring to believe what she'd heard. "I'm free." "You're free," Tom said, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. He'd actually done it. Against all odds, against all logic, he'd won. Morrison disappeared into his house without another word, leaving his men to deal with the aftermath. The Salt Lake City gamblers crowded around Tom, slapping his back and offering to buy him drinks, treating him like a celebrity, but Tom only had eyes for Ayana. She walked toward him slowly, as if afraid the moment might shatter like glass. When she reached him, she looked up into his grey eyes and saw something that had been absent from her life for months: respect, kindness, and the promise of choice. "Why?" she asked simply. Tom considered the question, thinking of his brother David, of all the times he'd chosen caution over courage, of the empty months since David's death when nothing had seemed to matter. "Because everyone deserves the chance to choose their own path," he said. "And because you reminded me that some things are worth fighting for." She reached out and took his hand, the first time she'd touched another person willingly in months. "What happens now?" she asked. Tom squeezed her hand gently. "Now you decide. You can go back to your people. You can go wherever you want. You're free. And you?" Tom smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd worn since David's funeral. "I was hoping maybe you'd let me ride with you for a while. At least until you figure out where you want to go." Ayana looked around at Morrison's compound, at the place that had been her prison for 3 months. Then she looked at Tom Mackenzie, this quiet cowboy who had risked everything for a woman he barely knew. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to see your ranch. I've heard good things about men who keep their word." As they walked toward Tom's horse, the Salt Lake City gamblers were already turning the evening into legend. The story of the cowboy who faced down Blackjack Morrison and won with an impossible shot. But Tom wasn't thinking about legends or stories. He was thinking about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that stretched ahead like an open trail under a vast sky. Behind them, Morrison watched from his window as they rode away into the darkness. His face was stone, but his eyes burned with the promise of future reckoning. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Ayana Crowfeather was free, and Tom Mackenzie had remembered what it felt like to be a hero. Sometimes, in the Old West, that was enough.